She's just a security guard. Those were the words my husband Mark announced to the wedding guests, his voice carrying over the music and laughter like a cruel drumbeat. My cheeks burned not from the champagne or the flashing lights of the chandelier, but from the humiliation that settled on my skin like acid. We were in the grand ballroom of the Westwood Plaza Hotel, a room dripping with luxury, every corner filled with roses and crystal, every chair covered in satin bows, every table glowing under candles. And there, at the head table, my own husband reduced me to nothing more than a prop in his story, a punchline to entertain strangers. He wanted them to see me as small, ordinary, unworthy of standing beside him. I heard the ripple of polite chuckles, saw the way a cousin leaned toward another guest and whispered something while hiding his smirk behind a glass of wine. My fingers clenched around the stem of my own glass until I feared it might shatter. I had dressed carefully for this night, a deep navy gown, modest yet elegant, my hair pinned back the way Mark liked, not too bold, not too loud. And yet no matter how I polished myself to him, I would always be just a guard, a shadow at the edge of someone else's story. I could taste the bitterness rising in my throat as I remembered the years I had given up for him, the career I had walked away from, the inheritance I had trusted him with, believing marriage meant unity. Instead, in front of 100 people, he had chosen to strip me of dignity. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the laughter, drowning out the music, until the only sound was his voice repeating just a security guard. It was not the first time he had humiliated me, but tonight it cut deeper because tonight he was performing. He wanted his guests, his new business partners, his family, and above all, his new CEO, to see that he, Mark the great provider, had married beneath himself. He wanted to elevate his own status by pushing me down in front of everyone else. I glanced toward the CEO, a tall woman in her 50s with silver earrings catching the light, her expression unreadable, her eyes sharp. She was new to his company, a woman he had been boasting about for weeks, telling me how her arrival would change everything. He wanted her to see him as powerful, ambitious, successful, married to a woman who was nothing more than background. He never imagined that the very sight of me would unravel everything he had built. My stomach twisted as I sat frozen at the table, the clinking of forks and glasses carrying on around me, as if the entire room had conspired to keep the humiliation alive. I wanted to stand, to shout, to remind him of the nights I had sat by his hospital bed when he was ill, the loans I had paid with my own savings, the sacrifices I had made to build the home he now showed off as his triumph. I wanted to scream that I was more than a guard, more than his shadow, more than his accessory. But my voice caught, my chest tightened, and all I could do was swallow the pain, hold my back straight, and wait, because deep inside, beneath the shame, something else stirred. It was not just anger, not just betrayal. It was the certainty that the story was not finished. He had humiliated me, yes. He had turned my life into a joke. But he did not know who I truly was. He did not know what I carried in my past, what truths I had locked away, what evidence I could reveal with a single word. And he did not know that before the night ended, before the candles burned low, every guest in this ballroom would see me differently. They would not see a guard. They would not see a woman crushed beneath her husband's pride. They would see the truth. And when his new CEO looked at me, she would not smile politely. She would scream. Before I take you further into that night, I want to pause and ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Are you sitting in your living room, maybe in the United States, maybe somewhere far away, perhaps in a quiet kitchen after dinner? Tell me in the comments below. I love knowing where my viewers are listening from because every story like mine connects across states and oceans. And while you are here, please remember to like this video and subscribe. I met Mark when I was 27 at a time when I still believed love could conquer ambition, when loyalty meant more than status. He was charming, then a junior executive with a grin that seemed to promise a lifetime of laughter, a man who told me I was brilliant, capable more than I ever gave myself credit for. I had just left the military after years of service, unsure of what path to follow next, and his attention felt like sunlight after months of cold. He said he admired my discipline, my calm under pressure, the way I carried myself, but even then, there were cracks in his praise. He would tease me about the uniform I had once worn, saying that while it was impressive, real power was built in boardrooms, not in dusty bases overseas. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was harmless, thinking it was simply his way of elevating his own world. As the years passed, his ambition grew sharper. Promotions carried him higher, and with each step upward, he looked back at me with new eyes, eyes that measured rather than cherished. I shifted into civilian life, took a job in security because it was steady, because it allowed me to use my instincts, my training, and most of all, because it kept me sane. He pretended to support me, but little comments slipped through sharp as knives. "One day, you'll want to do something bigger," he would say at parties, his arm heavy around my shoulder as if he were presenting me like an exhibit. Or, "Anna used to be in the military, but now she works the doors." Guests would smile politely, not knowing how to respond, while I forced a smile, swallowing the sting. Family gatherings were worse. His sister, elegant in her designer dresses, never missed a chance to remind me that I was lucky Mark had chosen me. She would tilt her head and ask if guarding doors was really fulfilling, as though she were speaking to a child about hobbies. His mother once asked me if I planned to ever return to the real world instead of standing in lobbies. They said these things in front of Mark, and though I waited for him to defend me, he never did. Sometimes he laughed with them. Other times he said nothing, which was worse because his silence was agreement. I told myself it was pride that he needed to feel important in his family's eyes, that belittling me was his misguided way of proving he had done well. I convinced myself that love meant patience, that the man who had once held me as though I were the most precious thing in his life still lived inside him somewhere. I clung to the memory of our early days, of his smile, of the warmth in his voice when he whispered that he could not imagine a future without me. But each time he introduced me as just Anna, "She does security work," that future felt more like a trap. The greatest betrayal was not only in his words but in his choices. When my father passed away, leaving me a modest inheritance, our family home a small portfolio of stocks and savings that represented a lifetime of sacrifice, Mark positioned himself as my guide. "Let me handle it," he insisted, sliding papers across the table, promising that he knew how to invest, how to protect what my father had built. I trusted him. I believed marriage meant partnership. I signed where he told me to, not realizing I was giving him control of assets that were my safety net, my father's legacy. Within months, he had moved everything under his name, explaining it as streamlining. I did not question him, though. A small voice inside me whispered that something was wrong. I silenced that voice for the sake of peace. But peace never came. Instead, he became bolder in his disregard, louder in his dismissal. When we walked into company functions, he spoke over me. At dinners with friends, he told stories that cast me as a punchline, someone whose career was a joke compared to his. I endured it, each word, chiseling away at my dignity, because I thought marriage meant endurance, because I thought betrayal came in the form of affairs or lies, not in the daily erosion of respect. Yet as I sat in that ballroom on the night of the wedding, listening to him declare to 100 guests that I was just a security guard, I realized betrayal had been eating at me for years. It was not sudden. It was not unexpected. It was a steady storm that had finally broken into a hurricane, and I was standing in the center, drenched and trembling, waiting for the next wave to crash. What I did not know then was that this betrayal, this moment of deepest humiliation, was only the beginning. Because what Mark did not understand, what none of them understood, was that I carried truths they could not imagine. And those truths would not only break his pride, but unravel the empire he had built on my silence. When my father died, the grief hollowed me out, but beneath the mourning lay something steady, the inheritance he left me. It was not vast by the standards of the wealthy, but to me it was priceless. A stone farmhouse on the edge of Pennsylvania where I had spent summers chasing fireflies. A portfolio of long-held stocks carefully nurtured through decades. A savings account that carried not just money, but intention, his dream that I would always have stability. My father had been a man of quiet dignity, a factory foreman who had built slowly, never indulging in extravagance, but always planning for the future. In his will, he left those assets directly to me, his only daughter, with words that still echo, for Anna to keep her safe and to remind her she was always worthy. At first, I tried to manage the paperwork myself, but the grief and the legal language overwhelmed me. Mark stepped in, presenting himself as the savior. "You don't need to drown in this," he said gently, sliding the files from my hands. "Let me take care of it. I know how to handle investments. You can trust me." His voice was reassuring, his hand warm over mine, and in that moment I felt relief. I wanted to believe marriage meant we were one. I wanted to believe he would guard my father's legacy as fiercely as I would. We sat in a lawyer's office, the air heavy with the scent of leather and old books. The lawyer explained the transfers, the consolidation of accounts, the titles. Mark leaned forward confidently, speaking as if he had studied finance all his life. He nodded at the right moments, asked polished questions, then turned to me with a look that said, "Sign, this is for us." My pen hesitated only once. I saw my father's signature at the bottom of the original will, his handwriting steady, and I thought of his intent that these things were mine. But Mark's hand pressed lightly on my back, and his voice whispered, "It's just a formality. We're a team." So I signed. Within weeks, the farmhouse deed bore his name beside mine, though in truth, his signature was the one that carried weight. The accounts shifted under his management, the shares moved into portfolios tied to his company contacts. He told me it was efficiency that we were streamlining. He promised me this was modern marriage, a partnership where he, the husband, bore the burden. I wanted to argue, but I told myself trust was the currency of love. I convinced myself my father would have wanted me to lean on my husband, but the changes began to show in subtle ways. Mark spoke differently with a swagger he had not possessed before. He entertained colleagues at the farmhouse calling it our estate, while I stood in the kitchen listening to strangers laugh in the rooms where my father had once read me bedtime stories. He poured wine for them and bragged about the investments he was making, investments that used my inheritance as collateral. When I asked for updates, he grew impatient. "Don't worry about it, Anna. You wouldn't understand the numbers." One evening, I found a bank statement tucked under a stack of bills. The balance was lower than I remembered. When I asked, he shrugged. "I moved some things around. It's all growing, trust me." I pressed, but his temper flared, his voice slicing through the air. "Do you want me to succeed or not? Do you want us to have a future, or do you want to live in that farmhouse forever like some country girl?" The words stung more than I admitted. I dropped the subject, swallowing my unease. But the unease grew. His sister began hinting that the estate was practically part of their family now. His mother spoke as if the farmhouse had always belonged to Mark, as though my father's memory had been erased. I realized with a chill that they saw my inheritance not as mine, but as a prize Mark had claimed by marrying me. They treated it like a victory proof that he had secured wealth by tethering himself to me. And he let them. He basked in their praise even as my stomach tightened. The final blow came when I discovered he had used the stocks my father's careful portfolio as leverage for a loan to expand his business ventures. He had not asked me. He had not told me. I only found out when I overheard him boasting to a colleague on the phone, his voice thick with pride. Yes, I had the assets in my back pocket. My wife inherited some old shares, so I freed them up. Easy, easy. As if my father's legacy was nothing more than poker chips for him to gamble. That night I confronted him. He brushed me off, his words sharp. "Stop acting like it's yours alone. We're married. Everything that was yours is ours. That's how this works." I stared at him, realizing that to him, marriage was not about love or partnership. It was acquisition. He had acquired me, and through me, my father's legacy. And in his eyes, that meant he had won. The greed was no longer hidden. It was worn like a badge. He had taken what was mine, paraded it as his triumph, and left me with nothing but silence. I went to bed that night with my heart heavy, telling myself I still had my dignity, that they could not strip me of who I was. But dignity is fragile when the people closest to you conspire to erase it. And as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I felt the first true spark of defiance flicker in my chest. Because if he thought I would stay silent forever, he was wrong. Mark thought he married a woman who would never challenge him. He thought by branding me as just a security guard, he had clipped my wings, confined me to a corner where no one would look too closely. What he never realized was that behind my quiet patience lived a past I had deliberately hidden, a history that frightened powerful people and toppled more than one career. I had not chosen to reveal it to him, not because I was ashamed, but because some truths are too heavy to carry into marriage. I had served in military intelligence for nearly a decade. My official title sounded ordinary enough, but my work was anything but. I specialized in forensic investigations, digging into financial webs that funded illicit operations. I learned to trace money across continents, to read between numbers the way some read between lines of poetry. I could see patterns in chaos, recognize fraud by the absence of a comma, and dismantle shell corporations like pulling threads from a sweater. My training taught me discipline, taught me to vanish in plain sight, to gather evidence without leaving shadows behind. When I left the military, it was not because I failed. It was because I succeeded too well. My last major operation had exposed a network of corruption stretching into corporations that touched the highest levels of politics. I had received commendations, but also veiled warnings. People in power do not like the spotlight turned on their dealings. My superiors advised me to step away, to start fresh before the wrong enemies turned their eyes toward me. So I walked away quietly and chose a life that looked small from the outside. A security job, steady and unnoticed, was the perfect cover. It allowed me to work with my hands to keep my instincts sharp, but it also allowed me to disappear into anonymity. I never told Mark. At first, I wanted to believe he loved me for who I was in the present, not for the medals or the files I carried in the past. Then, as his ambition revealed itself, I realized something darker if he knew he would use it. He would wield my past like a weapon, pulling it out when it served him, diminishing it when it did not. And I could not allow that. So I kept silent. I let him call me just a security guard, even as I knew I was more. But my past did not stay buried. Quietly, I kept files. Old habits die hard. I had encrypted drives stored away records of investigations, names of companies, whispers of deals that had been scrubbed from public record, but not from my memory. Among them was a file that mattered now more than ever, a case involving fraudulent stock transfers and offshore laundering. At the time, the name Claudia Richter had appeared only briefly in a list of executives connected to a suspicious account. It had been marked as inconclusive, unresolved, because she had resigned before the scandal erupted. But I had not forgotten the name. When Mark's company announced Claudia as their new CEO, I felt my stomach drop. I said nothing to him, but the alarm bells rang in my mind. I had seen her face before in grainy surveillance photos and clipped reports that never reached daylight. I knew she had walked away untouched from an operation that destroyed livelihoods, that she had been the phantom beneficiary of millions siphoned through shell companies. She had slipped away once, but her past was carved into my records like scars. I told myself to stay quiet, to bury the past once more, to let Mark dig his own grave with his arrogance. But when he paraded me at that wedding, when he mocked me in front of Claudia and the guests, something inside me snapped. He had stripped me of dignity for the last time. He had dared to do it in front of a woman who, unbeknownst to him, carried skeletons in her own closet, skeletons I had the key to unlock. That night, as the ballroom buzzed with laughter, I looked at Claudia and saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. It was subtle, a tightening of her jaw, a darting of her gaze, but I recognized fear when I saw it. She knew me. She remembered. She had thought the past was buried with her resignation, but the sight of me ripped it back into the present, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my hidden identity shifting from burden to weapon. I had chosen silence out of love once, out of protection, but love had soured and protection had been twisted into exploitation. Now, silence was no longer my duty. It was my enemy. Mark thought he owned my inheritance, my reputation, even my voice. But he had never owned my past. That belonged to me and me alone. As I sat in that ballroom, my humiliation still burning, I placed my hand lightly on my clutch. Inside was my phone, and within that phone, a drive encrypted and disguised, but alive with the files that had once shaken governments. I had not opened it in years. But tonight, I would. Because Mark was not the only one who thought he could manipulate appearances. Claudia had built her empire on hidden truths too, but she had forgotten the one person who could unearth them. My chest rose and fell as I steadied myself. Let them laugh, let them whisper. They had no idea who I was. They thought I was a guard. They thought I was invisible. but by the end of the night they would know the truth. My hidden past was no longer hidden, and its return would shake every corner of that glittering ballroom. And when Claudia's eyes finally locked with mine across the crowd, I saw the fear ignite. It was the fear of someone who had built her power on lies suddenly confronted with the one person who had the power to destroy it. The Westwood Plaza ballroom shimmered with an almost unnatural brilliance, every surface polished to perfection, every flower arranged in bursts of crimson and ivory. Guests floated across the marble floor in gowns that whispered wealth men in tuxedos exchanging firm handshakes, champagne glasses clinking like delicate bells. It should have been a night of unity, a celebration of two families coming together. But for me, it was a cage of glass where every eye could see through me. Mark thrived in this world, gliding between groups, his laughter loud and rehearsed, his hand tightening around mine, only when he needed to parade me as proof of his married stability. The seating arrangement said everything. Mark had placed me far from the head of the table, wedged between distant relatives and business associates who had no interest in conversation. He meanwhile sat near Claudia, his new CEO, leaning toward her with the kind of eager deference he had never once shown me. He wanted her to see him as indispensable a man with ambition that matched her power. And to paint the illusion, he needed me small. He needed me diminished. So he introduced me again and again with that same smirk. "This is Anna, my wife. She's just a security guard." Each repetition stripped another layer of my dignity until even strangers began to nod knowingly as if they now understood their place above me. The humiliation pressed like weights on my chest, but beneath it my training sharpened my senses. I noticed what others overlooked. The servers moving between tables seemed rushed to their trays unbalanced. One lingered too long by the sound booth adjusting wires that needed no adjustment. Another slipped near the back door, whispering into a phone before returning with a tray of champagne. The cameras mounted in the corners of the room, the same ones I had passed on my way in, had tiny strips of tape covering their indicator lights. No one else saw, but I saw. My pulse steadied. This was not just a party. Something was off. And if there was one thing I had learned in years of investigations, it was that anomalies multiply. I scanned the room again, tracing exits, memorizing positions. The bouquet near the door was too large, arranged to block line of sight. The bar was unusually crowded, the bartender pouring slower than necessary, creating a choke point. It all smelled of design, not accident. I reached for my clutch, my fingers brushing the phone inside, debating whether to send a message. I had contacts still, police officers who owed me favors, colleagues who trusted my instincts. But if I acted too soon, if I raised alarm without evidence, Mark would seize the chance to humiliate me further. He would call me paranoid, dramatic, unstable. He had done it before. I could hear his voice in my head. "Anna, stop embarrassing yourself." Still, the unease coiled tighter. My eyes landed on Claudia. She was poised at the head table, her silver earrings glittering under the chandeliers. She exuded control, sipping her wine with practiced grace, but every so often her gaze darted around the room, scanning not unlike my own. Then, for the briefest moment, our eyes met. And in that instant, recognition flashed across her face. Not polite curiosity, not vague familiarity. Real recognition. The kind that stiffens the spine and drops the breath from your chest. She looked away quickly, too quickly, but not before I saw her lips press into a thin line. My heart thundered. She knew me. She remembered. The woman who now commanded Mark's loyalty, who held his career in her hands, was the same woman whose name had once crossed my desk in a classified report. The same woman tied to fraud, to hidden accounts, to whispers of corruption buried before the public could see. And now, here she was, elevated, untouchable, leading his company as if her slate had always been clean. Mark leaned close to her, his hand brushing her arm as he laughed at something she said. He did not see the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her shoulders. He did not see her fingers tapping nervously against her glass. But I did. Every instinct in me screamed that the stage was set for more than a wedding toast. There was a collision coming, and I was standing at the very center of it. The night deepened. Music swelled as couples drifted to the dance floor. Mark pulled Claudia forward, eager to show off his connection, leaving me in my seat like an abandoned prop. Guests glanced at me with pity or amusement, no one daring to speak. My humiliation should have consumed me, but it didn't. It crystallized into something sharper, colder. I straightened in my chair, shoulders back, breathing steady. Because while they saw a discarded wife, I was already calculating angles, already piecing together the evidence in my head. Then the moment came. Claudia turned toward me from across the room. Our gazes locked again. This time there was no escape in her eyes, only panic. Her hand slipped from Mark's arm, her face drained of color, and then, in a voice that cut through the music, she screamed. The sound was raw, unpolished, nothing like the corporate composure she had worn all evening. Conversations stopped. Guests froze mid-step. The band faltered. Every head turned toward her then, to me, as her finger lifted trembling, pointing across the room. The silence that followed was unbearable, the kind that amplifies every heartbeat, every breath. Mark rushed to her side, confused, his hand grasping her elbow. "What is it? What's wrong?" he demanded, his voice panicked but also desperate to maintain control. Claudia could not answer immediately. Her eyes never left mine. She was seeing not Anna the security guard, not Mark's humiliated wife. She was seeing the investigator, the shadow from her past, the woman whose files contained the truths she had buried. And in that silence, in that scream, the balance of power shifted. Guests who had smirked at me minutes earlier now stared with wide eyes, whispering frantically. Phones lifted discreetly, recording capturing the CEO of a major corporation unraveling at the mere sight of a woman she should have dismissed. Mark's face twisted in confusion, then suspicion, his ambition flickering with the fear of losing control. He looked between us, his pride warring with disbelief, and for the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, but inside I was steel. The humiliation of earlier was gone, burned away by Claudia's scream. Because now the room was no longer laughing at me. The room was listening. And I knew the next words spoken would decide everything. My marriage, his career, her empire, my father's legacy. The night was no longer Mark's stage. It was mine, and the curtain had just risen. The scream echoed through the ballroom like glass shattering on marble. It was not a polite gasp, not a delicate cry. It was primal, ripping the veil of civility clean away. Claudia clutched the edge of the table as if she might collapse, her eyes locked on me wide and wild. For a moment, no one moved. The chandeliers glowed above, the candles flickered, but the entire ballroom seemed frozen in that suspended second where the world forgets how to breathe. Then the whispers began. "What's wrong with her?" a guest muttered, clutching his drink tighter. "Is she ill?" another asked. "Why is she pointing at the wife?" The word wife carried like a dart across the silence, reminding everyone that I was not just a stranger, but the woman Mark had moments earlier belittled. And now the powerful CEO he had pinned his hopes on was staring at me as if she had seen a ghost. Mark rushed to her side, his hand gripping her arm. "Claudia, what is this? What's happening?" His voice cracked with a desperation he tried to mask with control, but his cheeks had flushed, his jaw tight. He looked around nervously, aware of the dozens of phones that had been lifted discreetly, cameras glowing like watchful eyes. Claudia's voice trembled when she spoke. "Her. Why is she here?" Her finger shook as she pointed at me, and the entire room followed its direction until every eye was on me. My throat was dry, but I did not falter. I met her gaze steadily, my posture calm, my expression unreadable. Inside, however, I felt the tectonic plates of my life shifting. Here was the moment, the collapse of the facade both she and Mark had so carefully constructed. Mark's brows furrowed. He looked from her to me, then back again, his confusion turning into something sharper. "What are you talking about?" "That's my wife Anna. She's—" He hesitated, his own words catching in his throat, realizing suddenly how they sounded. "She's just a security guard." The guests inhaled collectively, the cruelty of his words, magnified now in the light of Claudia's fear. Claudia snapped her gaze to him, disbelief flashing across her features. "A guard, you fool! Do you even know who she is?" Mark blinked. The arrogance that had always dripped from him faltered. "She's my wife," he repeated, but this time his voice was smaller. Claudia's hands trembled. She pressed them to her mouth, her body shaking as though the weight of a decade had just landed on her shoulders. "I know her," she whispered loud enough for the guests nearby to hear. "I know exactly who she is." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Guests craned their necks, reporters who had been invited for publicity pressed forward eagerly. Mark's grip on Claudia's arm tightened, his voice sharp. "Explain yourself." Her eyes darted back to me, and I saw the battle raging within her, the instinct to deny, to escape fighting against the sheer terror of being unmasked. And then, in a trembling voice, she said she was the one. She was the one who investigated us. The words dropped like a bomb. The murmurs became gasps. Mark's face paled, his lips parting. "Investigated," he repeated, as though the word itself was foreign. I rose slowly from my chair, every movement deliberate, my spine straight, my eyes never leaving hers. The room seemed to shrink until there was only the three of us, me, my husband, and the woman whose empire had been built on secrets. My voice, when it came, was calm but razor sharp. "You remember, don't you, Claudia, 10 years ago? Offshore accounts, falsified stock transfers, shell companies built to funnel money through the cracks of the system. You thought no one was watching." Claudia's knees buckled. 2 executives leapt forward to steady her, but she shook them off violently, her eyes darting around the room. "Stop," she hissed. "Not here, not now." But it was too late. The silence of the guests had turned to hungry curiosity. Phones were now held high, recording every word. Claudia's scream had already drawn attention, but now her confession was weaving its way into the feeds of strangers beyond the ballroom walls. Mark staggered backward, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. "What is she talking about? Anna?" His voice cracked. "What are you hiding?" I turned to him, my expression cold. "I'm hiding nothing. You just never bothered to ask who I really was. You were too busy parading me as your accessory, too busy silencing me when my voice could have mattered. You saw a guard. You never saw the woman who dismantled empires with a paper trail." Gasps rippled across the crowd. Someone clapped a hand over their mouth. Someone else whispered, "My God, she's intelligence." Mark shook his head violently. "No, this is absurd." He turned back to Claudia, demanding, "Tell them you're mistaken." But Claudia's composure had cracked. She shook her head, sweat gleaming on her forehead. "She's not mistaken. She's dangerous. She knows things that should never have seen the light." Her voice rose to a shrill pitch. "She could destroy me." My lips curved into a thin smile, though my heart pounded in my chest. "Not just you, Claudia. Anyone who thinks power erases the past should be afraid." The guests recoiled, shifting uneasily in their seats. What had begun as a glittering celebration had transformed into a courtroom, a stage for confession and revelation. Mark lunged toward me, his eyes blazing. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why did you let me humiliate myself?" I met his fury with icy calm. "Because you never asked. Because every time I tried to speak, you silenced me. Because you didn't want a partner, you wanted a trophy you could diminish. Tonight you got exactly what you created." The words cut deeper than any blade. Mark froze, his face contorting with rage and shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of sirens outside the hotel stole the attention of every guest. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, bathing the ballroom in hues of judgment. The doors burst open and uniformed officers stepped inside. Their presence silenced the room instantly. The lead officer's voice rang out. "Claudia Richter, we need to speak with you immediately." The gasp that followed was almost a second scream. Claudia stumbled backward, her facade of power collapsing entirely. She tried to protest, but the sight of badges and handcuffs ended the performance. Guests murmured in shock, their phones capturing every step as the once untouchable CEO faced the very justice she had evaded for years. And as she was escorted out, her eyes met mine one last time. They were filled with hatred, yes, but also recognition, the acknowledgement that the ghost from her past had returned, and that this time the truth could not be buried. Mark stood rooted, his world tilting, his empire cracking. He looked at me, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time. But it was too late. The damage was done. The scream that had started as humiliation had become revelation, and there was no returning to the silence that once protected him. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and music, now buzzed with the energy of scandal. Guests whispered frantically, their gazes flicking between me and the door where Claudia had been led away. And in that moment, I understood I had not just endured betrayal. I had turned it into exposure. I had not just been humiliated, I had become the instrument of reckoning. And the night was far from over. The ballroom air was electric buzzing with the kind of tension that clings to skin and refuses to let go. The officers had just led Claudia out, but her absence left a vacuum no music could fill. Guests leaned across tables, whispering furiously, fingers flying across phones, some calling friends, others live-streaming the spectacle. The laughter and polite chatter of earlier had dissolved into a chorus of questions and accusations, but I was not finished, not yet. Mark's face was pale. His jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck bulged. He spun toward me, desperation dripping from his voice. "Anna, tell them this is nonsense. Tell them you don't know her, that this is some kind of mistake." His eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, for someone to back his narrative. But the room had shifted. The power had shifted. For once, no one was laughing with him. They were waiting for me. I rose slowly, my heels clicking against the marble as I walked to the center of the ballroom. Every step carried the weight of years of humiliation, every breath steady with the discipline I had learned long ago. When I reached the microphone left behind from earlier speeches, I did not hesitate. I lifted it, my voice carrying through the silence. "You've all heard my husband call me just a security guard tonight." I began, my tone calm but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "You've seen him diminish me, laugh at me, erase me in front of you all. But what he never cared to know, what he never asked, is who I truly am." I pulled my phone from my clutch, the small device suddenly heavy in my hand. With a few swift taps, I connected it to the ballroom's projector, a feature Mark had insisted on for his grand slideshow earlier. The screen flickered to life and gasps rippled through the crowd as documents appeared, scans of financial statements, email chains, wire transfers marked confidential. These, I continued scrolling through the evidence, are the records of an operation that nearly bankrupted hundreds of families 10 years ago. Millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts disguised as legitimate investments. And at the center of it all, Claudia Richter, the woman you welcomed tonight as your shining new CEO. The room erupted. Executives at Mark's table shot to their feet, some shouting in denial, others demanding explanations. Journalists surged forward, snapping photos of the screen, recording every word. Mark's hands shook as he reached for the mic, but I stepped back, refusing to let him wrest control. "These files were never meant to see daylight," I said, my voice rising. "They were buried, redacted, sealed under layers of bureaucracy. But I kept them. I kept them because I knew one day the truth would need to be seen." And tonight, when she screamed at the sight of me, she admitted what she thought she had escaped. Mark lunged toward me, his voice frantic. "You're destroying me, Anna. Do you understand what you're doing? You'll ruin us." I turned on him, the weight of years of silence finally breaking. "You ruined us long before tonight. You took my inheritance, my father's legacy, and you gambled it away to impress people like her. You mocked me, belittled me, erased me. And now the same greed that made you strip me of dignity will strip you of your empire." The crowd gasped again, the revelation landing heavier than the last. Guests murmured, piecing together the puzzle, the farmhouse, the inheritance, the loans Mark had bragged about. His own arrogance had left a trail as damning as Claudia's. The lead officer stepped back into the room, accompanied by 2 detectives in plain clothes. They approached the screen, their eyes scanning the evidence with grim familiarity. One of them nodded sharply. "This corroborates ongoing investigations," he said loudly, ensuring the room heard. "We'll need copies of these files." Mark's composure cracked completely. He staggered backward, sweat pouring down his temple. "Anna, stop this. You're my wife," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You're supposed to stand by me." I met his plea with a steady gaze. "A husband stands by his wife too, Mark. But you never did. You only stood on top of me, using my silence as your ladder." The room was silent again, every guest absorbing the devastation. The projector displayed one final document, a transfer of assets signed by me years ago, handing control of my inheritance to Mark. Next to it, I displayed a notarized statement I had obtained just weeks earlier, confirming the coercion behind those signatures. "You thought my father's legacy was yours?" I said, my voice low but carrying. "But tonight, the law will see it differently." The detectives exchanged looks. One pulled out his phone, speaking quickly into it, while the other turned to Mark. "We'll need you to come with us." Panic surged across his face. "No, this is my wedding night. This is absurd." He flailed, looking toward his family, but they shrank back, unwilling to share his shame. His sister, who had mocked me for years, stared at the floor. His mother dabbed her eyes, shaking her head as if she had never known him at all. Two officers stepped forward, and though they did not cuff him immediately, the implication was clear. The guests recorded everything, their cameras ensuring that the world outside these walls would see the fall of Mark and Claudia. I stood there steady, the humiliation of hours earlier burned away in the fire of truth. The woman they had dismissed as a nobody, a guard, had become the witness, the accuser, the proof. I had turned their stage into a courtroom, their laughter into silence. And in that silence, I felt my father's voice in my heart, telling me I was worthy. Mark turned to me one last time as the officers led him away, his voice breaking. "You'll regret this." But I did not for a second, because regret belongs to those who lose their humanity for greed. I had not lost mine. I had reclaimed it. And as the doors closed behind him, the ballroom erupted again. Not with laughter this time, but with shock, disbelief, and the first murmurs of justice finally catching up. The ballroom emptied slowly, but the whispers lingered like smoke clinging to the walls. Guests drifted out in clusters, their voices buzzing with the scandal they had just witnessed. Phones still glowed in trembling hands as messages flew into the night, carrying the story far beyond the marble and chandeliers of the Westwood Plaza. Within hours, the entire city would know. Within days, the nation. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, the echoes of Claudia's scream and Mark's protests still vibrating in my chest. My hands trembled not from fear, but from release. For years, I had lived in the shadow of his arrogance, silenced by his constant dismissals, diminished by his cruelty. Tonight, the silence had ended. Mark's family gathered in a corner, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding mine. His sister, who had once sneered at me and called me unworthy of their name, now clutched her pearls as though her entire world was collapsing. His mother, who had told me I should be grateful for Mark's attention, sat weeping softly into a lace handkerchief as if she were the victim. Not one of them looked at me with compassion. They looked at me with fear, as though my refusal to remain silent had shattered the foundation of their carefully constructed world. Detectives stayed behind, questioning witnesses, collecting statements. They assured me that my evidence would hold weight in court, that Claudia's past and Mark's greed were finally unraveling. One of them, a grizzled man with tired eyes, pulled me aside. "You just did what most people can't. You exposed them publicly. That takes guts." I nodded, though inside, I felt less like a hero and more like a survivor. The weight of years of betrayal was heavy, but now it was shifting, redistributing itself into something new. Justice was not complete, not yet, but it had begun. The following weeks were a blur of hearings, subpoenas, and headlines. Claudia's arrest dominated the news, her photograph plastered across every screen with captions that screamed corruption. Footage of her scream of her pointing at me across the ballroom replayed endlessly. She was forced to step down as CEO within 48 hours. Her empire crumbled as investigators dug into her past, unearthing the trail of fraud I had preserved all those years. Mark did not escape. His use of my inheritance to fund illegal ventures tied him directly to Claudia's network. The transfer documents I had shown, paired with testimony from the lawyer who had witnessed my coerced signature, unraveled his claims of ownership. Prosecutors moved quickly, freezing his assets, seizing accounts, and opening charges of fraud and misappropriation. The farmhouse once overrun by his colleagues and family was returned to me by court order. The judge's words echoed with a satisfaction I had long craved. These assets were taken under coercion. They are restored to their rightful owner. But the fallout extended beyond the courtroom. Mark's family, stripped of the prestige they had once basked in, turned on each other like vultures fighting over scraps. His sister filed desperate lawsuits claiming promises that never existed. His mother retreated from public view, ashamed of the empire her son had built on lies. For all their years of mockery, their disdain for me, they were now pariahs. The same community that once admired them now whispered about their greed, their downfall, their blindness. And Mark, my husband, faced the harshest truth of all. In prison whites sitting across from me during a required deposition, he no longer looked like the man who had once swept me into his world. His hair was unkempt, his eyes hollow, his arrogance drained. He leaned across the table, his voice a broken whisper. "I thought I owned you. I thought you'd never speak. Why did you have to destroy everything?" I looked at him steadily, the ache in my chest dulled into steel. "You destroyed it yourself, Mark. I just stopped protecting your lies." The silence between us was final. There was no love left to salvage, no partnership to repair. Only ashes of a marriage that had been nothing more than a transaction to him. Justice was slow grinding, but it was relentless. Claudia faced years in federal prison. Mark, too. Their names, once polished with status, became synonymous with greed and betrayal. And me, the woman they had called invisible, was suddenly visible in every headline. Some painted me as a whistleblower, others as a betrayed wife who fought back. But beneath the labels, I was simply myself again. And though justice brought satisfaction, the deeper justice was personal. I walked through the farmhouse once more, running my fingers along the banister my father had built, smelling the wood and dust that had shaped my childhood. It was mine again. Not because of Mark, not because of anyone else, but because I had fought for it, because I had refused to let greed erase memory. That was the truest justice of all. The courthouse steps felt strangely quiet the day the final ruling was read. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, but for me, the noise faded into the background. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, steady and strong as the judge's words echoed in my memory. The estate is restored to Anna Carter. The fraudulent transfers are void. Restitution will be pursued. Years of humiliation, years of silence had led to this moment. My father's legacy was mine again, cleansed of the fingerprints that had tried to steal it. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt not just with bricks and deeds, but with intention. The farmhouse became my refuge once more. I walked through its rooms at dawn, the wooden floors creaking beneath my feet, like an old friend greeting me back. I restored the gardens, planting roses my father had once promised my mother, and every bloom felt like defiance against the years Mark had claimed ownership, but it was not enough to reclaim. I needed to transform. With the inheritance secured, I founded a trust in my father's name. Its purpose was simple: to protect those who had been financially or emotionally exploited by people they once trusted. I met women who had been coerced into signing away homes parents whose children had manipulated them into ruined partners who had been gaslit into silence. Their stories echoed mine, and together we built something larger than survival. We built a shield. The media, hungry for narratives of betrayal and redemption, latched onto my story. Interviews painted me as the woman who had gone from being dismissed as just a guard to dismantling an empire of greed. At first, the spotlight felt unnatural. I had spent years hiding, burying my past to protect myself. But as I spoke publicly, as I shared the lessons I had paid dearly to learn, I realized the truth. Silence had never protected me. It had only served those who exploited it. My voice was my greatest weapon. Mark, behind bars, attempted letters, pleas for forgiveness, for understanding, even for reconciliation. I burned them unopened. A marriage built on betrayal was not a marriage at all. Claudia, too, tried to send messages through intermediaries bargaining for leniency, but her empire was dust. Justice had claimed her. Their downfall was not my victory. It was the inevitable consequence of greed. My victory was freedom. The scars remained. There were nights I woke sweating, hearing again the laughter of that ballroom, the sting of Mark's words. But alongside the pain came something new: strength. I no longer walked into rooms with lowered eyes. I no longer let anyone introduce me as less than I was. I carried myself with the certainty of a woman who had faced ruin and chosen to rise. At the farmhouse's front porch, I hosted dinners not for executives or power players, but for friends, neighbors, and those rebuilding their own lives. We shared food, laughter, and stories of survival, and every time someone asked me how I endured, I told them the same thing I remembered who I was, even when they tried to make me forget, because that was the heart of it. Mark's betrayal, Claudia's greed, even my family-in-law's mockery. None of it had truly erased me. They had only convinced me to stay silent. The moment I broke that silence, the moment I let the truth out, the balance shifted, and with it, my life. Now, when I walk through the farmhouse gardens at dusk, the air scented with roses and the sky painted in twilight, I feel my father's presence beside me. I imagine his voice calm and steady, saying the words he once wrote in his will, for Anna to keep her safe and to remind her she was always worthy. For years I forgot, but now I remember, and I will never forget again. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to love and protect you only to rise above and prove them wrong? My story is just one among many, but I know I am not alone. I want to hear from you. Share your experiences in the comments, because your voice matters and your truth deserves to be heard. And if you believe stories of betrayal and justice need to be told, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the next story.